In these times of uncertainty, it's all the more important that we keep collaborating, informing, and inspiring each other, so that we can be smarter and better tomorrow. Welcome to the Pakhuis de Zwijger LIVECAST.
Good afternoon. My name is Tracy Metz. On behalf of Pakhuis de Zwijger and publisher NIE 010, I would like to welcome you to this Zoom webinar and livecast about the book How to Build an Indian House by the Indian architect Sameep Padora. It deals with the past, but definitely also with the future of affordable housing in Mumbai, one of the world's most complex cities, as we will see on this beautiful aerial image of Mumbai. The book was supposed to be presented at the Architecture Biennial in Venice, but now this is the official launch here in Amsterdam. This is the book. It actually shows not only how rich Indian architecture can be, but it also addresses the critical housing situation in Mumbai and in India in general. Just how critical became very apparent during the corona crisis, when the government announced a strict lockdown from 1 minute to the next. People were crammed into small, overcrowded dwellings, and of course, many people have no dwelling at all. As Sameep Padora said in his TEDx talk last year, Mumbai's architecture is slowly killing us. And this was long before COVID-19. So how big is the housing crisis in Mumbai? Is its architecture slowly killing its dwellers? And what needs to be done to give these people a healthy home? We also see an image of Mumbai streetscape, and you see what a congested and vibrant place Mumbai is. We invited 3 speakers today. Of course, Sameep Padora, joining us from Mumbai. Welcome.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
Good. And here in the studio, we have with us Dick van Gameren, an architect and dean of the Faculty of Architecture and the Built Environment at the Technical University in Delft. He knows India well and also wrote the foreword for the book. Also here with us today is Vidhi Garg. Vidhi, welcome.
Thank you.
She grew up in Mumbai, where she studied architecture, and actually Sameep was one of her professors. So you get to see each other again, even at a distance. And then finished her studies at Cornell in the US. She worked for the New York City Housing Development Corporation and for the Affordable Housing Institute. She left Boston to move to Amsterdam about a year ago and is a consultant on housing and urban development. Feel free to join the conversation via Zoom with the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can send in your questions and I will see them appear here on the iPad on my desk. The book, Sameep, the first question to you. Why this book? What is good living in a megalopolis like Mumbai?
Well, to be honest, the book really came out of a project that we were asked to design, an affordable housing project by a developer, for which we started looking at the available literature on how people design housing in a city like Mumbai. While there were fantastic narratives about how people lived in small spaces throughout the history of Mumbai, there wasn't anything that spoke about the architecture of the city. So what we really wanted to do was just start, in some sense, excavating these models of housing that existed in the city, just to see and learn from it to design a project. But what happened was, once we started looking, we found such an incredible body of knowledge that turned into a project itself, and that's how the book came about. The learnings have been incredible. I mean, it's really showed us a means to look at housing not just through the idea of the four walls that you design and the room that you define, but also all of the spaces that lie outside and adjacent to the dwellings themselves, and how important these spaces are. So yeah, that's really how the book came about.
In the book, you discuss 5 different types of housing, but there's a lot of attention for the type called the chawl. Perhaps
Right.
at the beginning of our discussion, it's good if you tell us what a chawl is and why it's so important.
Right. So the chawls actually were essentially worker housing. They were built as single room or double room tenement for people who would migrate to the city to work in the industry, the textile industry, which was huge in Mumbai. What happened, however, is that these chawls over the history of Mumbai's kind of development have morphed. They've evolved into buildings that are completely different from what they started off being, and yet they are of the time and perhaps of the future as well. So chawls, though they started off as worker housing meant to be shared, units to be shared by one or two workers, they eventually became family dwellings. And to accommodate for this kind of change, there was a sizable amount of change in the architecture of the original chawls as well. And I
So,
think that's really kind of,
so they were
spectacular.
not designed as family dwellings to begin with. These were migrant workers
No,
who came alone to the city.
that's right.
Aha.
That's right. So they didn't have, for instance, toilets as a part of the house. They were common toilets that people would use together. There wasn't a kitchen. The kitchen was also located. Maybe somebody in let's say in one of the chawls, there used to be a lady who cooked for all of the workers living there, and the tenement would be given to her free because she would actually provide that service. But these have morphed completely. So now they've added bathrooms, they've added kitchens, in some places they've added additional rooms, and they've been done with such incredible ingenuity that there's a wealth of knowledge there for us to learn.
One of the chawls that is in the book, may I see the picture of Mota Mandir? It's what really strikes you about so many of these chawls is how important the shared social space is.
That's absolutely right.
Was that designed or did
The
that just happen?
No, I think it happens. It's when people start living in these spaces that they actually start appropriating spaces that were not maybe designed to be a part of the house, but they start using it almost naturally as an extension of the interior of the house. So the binary of what is public and what is private is extremely fuzzy in spaces like this. So you tend to sometimes programs would expand from within your house to the area outside. Maybe your neighbor also occupies the same space. Maybe you sit across and chat in the evenings. You maybe share a meal. So it really became a space that was heavily used by people for their daily routines, and it wasn't something just used during festivals or things like that. So,
But the chawls date from, well, easily a century ago. Are they still, have they morphed into a way that they're still relevant for Indian society now?
I mean, well, in the sense that these chawls actually have shown us that there are models that we could look at besides the apartment type, which is one bedroom, two bedroom, where spaces are designed to function in a particular way, irrespective of time, irrespective of the event that they hold. So a bedroom is used for sleeping, a living room is used for kind of sitting around. But what you actually find in some of the studies that we did was the fact that these spaces also changed through the day. The events that occurred in these spaces changed through the day as well. So that kind of flexibility is something that we can take away from the chawls, and more so now. I mean, it's so strange that this time during COVID, we suddenly all started working from home. And now you suddenly realize the need for flexibility and where a living room can convert into a workspace as well. But that's been happening forever in chawls. So, yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. Dick, a question for you. This really very handsome book is about India, housing typologies, affordable housing. Why should we in the Netherlands want to know about this?
Well, first of all, simply, it really, I think, a beautiful book. The documentation in drawings and photography of this project is really marvelous. It's one of the best books on housing I've seen in the last years. So I think that's already a reason to read and to study the book. But I think it's also a discovery because, as Sameep already explained, a substantial part of the book is showing the Chowdharys, this quite unique housing figure that is, I think, really unknown in the rest of the world. And I think it's inspiring, can inspire us all. Because we are also here in this part of the world dealing with a kind of housing crisis again. We need a lot of housing, urban housing, dense housing. We are looking to small apartments, but how can they have quality in a city? And I think these Mumbai examples can also be an inspiration for us.
Is the flexibility that Sameep was talking about, is that something that we can learn from here in a different society, a different constellation, and learn how to bring that flexibility into new housing?
Certainly. I think what the book also in a wonderful way documents is how also the dwellers, the residents, change how tiny they are, their homes over the years, and how they could adapt them to their changing needs. And I think that is a quality of housing that often lacks nowadays. And certainly in the Netherlands, if it doesn't function anymore, we just build something new. There it goes.
Yeah. Very wasteful business, the building business.
And we have, of course, we cannot go on like that. Yeah.
And that flexibility, is that something that needs time to grow, or can you actually build that into a new design? If I hear Sameep talking about the Chowdharys, this is something that evolves over a century. Can we learn from that and drop it into our society, our housing?
I think it's both. We can learn from it. As a designer, architect, we can try to think of the future of our projects. That's the start. How can it be adapted over time? On the other hand, I think also things happen that you had never expected. So it's this combination.
Yeah.
And what you can see, what can come out of that combination, makes this book so intriguing.
Vidhi, a question for you, which addresses also this flexibility, which Sameep put into words eloquently, and that we also really see the need for here in the Netherlands. The Chowdharys were described also as army barracks in the beginning. That doesn't sound very hospitable or very flexible.
No, it doesn't. And I mean, if you look at some of the drawings in the book as well, or you look at the pictures, you know, it's 20 units to a floor, 10 on each side of the corridor, and there's, you know, toilets and bathrooms at one end.
Very
and
regimented.
So it's very regimented. And I mean, these are the BDD chawls. I know the, you know, BIT chawls and the others that were built by private business owners are different, but talking about the BDD chawls, absolutely, you know, very
BDD
much.
being Bombay
Development Directorate.
Directorate.
Yes. And so, yes, they were absolutely regimented. And, you know, as Sameep said, that they were built for migrant workers in the textile mills. So it was very much, you know, you're going to have 1 to 5, sometimes I think even 10 people to a room. And because they lived there in shifts. They worked in shifts and they lived there in shifts. And sorry, okay. But I think that's what's interesting is, you know, you might build it for someone, but a century later, these buildings are still standing. And you look at them now, you visit them now, they do not look like army barracks at all, you know, because the households and the residents have morphed it and added to it and changed it in such remarkable ways and adapted it to their own use. So I would say yes. I mean, it was, but no longer has a semblance of army barracks.
It reminds me of the Unité d'habitation by Le Corbusier, which was also very, you know, he had very strict ideas about how we should live.
Right.
And then when you go there now, people have made it their own. Apparently these buildings can change and adapt, and that's heartening.
Right.
Dick, you were going to say?
Yeah, well, I obviously agree, but what I think, what you can also see in these chawls, they might have a kind of regimental first impression, very strict, but still they allow for open space, for collective space where people can meet, and they need that because their private space is minimal. And the scary thing, and that's also documented in the book, and that makes it also such an intriguing reading, with what you see, what the housing production at this moment is in terms of affordable housing. It's also rather regimental, but the scale has become so immense that any space, let's say, to meet or to enjoy an outside atmosphere is not there anymore.
Sameep, what is the housing like that's being built in Mumbai now? Are you indeed building a modern day equivalent of the Chawls?
Well, we're actually the project that we were designing for which we actually did all the research is half built and is currently stalled because of COVID. But yeah, we are actually we took a lot of the learnings from the book and used that to actually inform the project. But unfortunately, that's just a one-off. It's not the way housing is being built in the city, it's essentially an idea of providing real estate. It's about quantity. It's not really about qualitative indices. And I think for that you also need to look at what the building codes are and what is the policy that actually creates this kind of housing. In fact, our current research looks exactly at that. What is the kind of building code that would create environments like you see in the Chawls, the kind of open space, social space that you actually find? What is the kind of building code that will allow for that to happen? An interesting note on the BDD actually was the fact that these regimental blocks have a fantastic open space between them, which actually is a result of the need for light and ventilation post the 1898 plague that hit Mumbai. So it comes from a need to, and it's really very strange when you think about it that we are once again back in a point where there is a pandemic. And now, once again, we need housing form to learn how to actually reconstruct itself.
Well, I'm curious what the answer of this coming era of housing will be to the next plague pandemic.
Yeah.
Could we see the picture, the aerial view of Mumbai? Beautiful photograph, but at the same time rather intimidating because it looks like there are two kinds of places. There's low rise, small scale, crowded, getting decrepit, and these high rises, way expensive, no outside space. They don't look really any more attractive than the shabby old stuff on the ground.
Absolutely, and I think one of the things that is interesting to also just kind of contextualize this. If you look at the new housing that's being built, and that by no means is social housing. It's essentially housing for the rich because the state pretty much doesn't build too much social housing anymore. So all of that housing actually advertises disconnection from the context. It talks about how a building is called Miami because it's by the sea, but it's no longer. Yeah, it's not about how the building is sitting in its context. It's really about its disconnection. Even the names actually exemplify that. And if you look at the older projects, they're really about a connection with the city and the way that spaces around them are almost suited into the fabric of what Mumbai is. So yeah, that's a big difference.
Probably the most famous house in Mumbai, if I'm not mistaken, is the 27-floor single-family dwelling of what's the
Ambani
Mukesh Ambani.
Yes,
tower.
well, those are excesses. We don't need to go there. Did the recent lockdown, Sameep, when Modi said everybody has to go home right now, stay home, and that sent a tremendous exodus of very poor people walking 1,300 kilometers back to home in Bihar, and heartrending. Will this make the state think any differently about the need to provide adequate housing for people? As you just said, the state hardly plays a role now in affordable housing at all.
Yeah, that's actually a great question. One thing that any kind of crisis and a pandemic like this as well does is that it only brings to the fore the problems that already existed. So there is always, for a long time, been this kind of housing crisis, affordable housing crisis, and the fact that so many people chose to leave the city and go back, walking such large distances to their homes, just tells you, it just shows you what kind of environment they lived in here. And I think we need to rethink the entire format by which housing is delivered in the city of Mumbai. It's essentially, like I said, the state thinks like a developer as well. What they try to realize is the land potential, the profit that a piece of land, even if they own the land, the profit that a piece of land can generate. It's not about people, it's really about money. which is fair to a certain extent, but it cannot be at the expense of people. And I think that's what's happening right now. Well, I hope the crisis actually allows us to reconstruct this entire model.
Vidhi?
Yeah. So, like you said, there are all of these images and stories of migrants walking back home hundreds and thousands of kilometers. And like Sameep said, it just shows you the kind of conditions that they were living in. And, it really hits home that, home is a place to shelter, and it's, obviously you're living as a migrant, you're living away from your family back in the rural areas. But at least if you have a safe home, an adequate home, if you want to stay there, you can shelter there. You have the option of sheltering there, right? And I think the other thing it has shown, so obviously it's affected the health and, it has health and economic consequences for the migrants themselves. But I think it also has economic consequences for the cities, right? And for Bombay itself, for that matter, because...
You said Bombay.
Oh, sorry. I will try not to be political here. Force of habit. But anyway, so it does have economic consequences for the city as well, because the city runs on migrants, right? From your household help to your construction laborers to everything. And it's really shown us that, and I know people, it sounds superficial, but people are worried about, okay, how will our businesses get back to normal? How will we get our house help back? And these are real, which is why I think, maybe I'm the eternal optimist, but I'm very glad that this has really, like Sameep said, brought to the fore what we already knew as urbanists and as housing enthusiasts and, urban planners. But I'm glad that it's come up to the consciousness of everybody at this time. And I hope it stays there, and I hope there's action at the collective level to address this issue.
Just to play the devil's advocate for a moment, you said a lot of people have to be able to shelter at home. That's why they decided that they had no other option than to try to walk halfway across the subcontinent to get back to their village. But weren't people leaving not because of the housing situation, but because they simply didn't have any money to buy food or to pay the rent?
Right. And exactly. I think it's both.
That says nothing about the quality of the housing, though.
Yes and no, because, so I mean, my work, one of the things, and I'm sure Sameep and Dick will agree with this, is that, it's hard to talk about housing or, doing a housing project in isolation. It is so closely tied to your jobs, your livelihood, your transportation, your education, all of that. And, a lot of migrants, if you just delve a little bit deeper into this, is, they were either kicked out of their housing because, they didn't have the money, and their landlords, in a lot of cases, also couldn't afford to, continue to sort of rent out the housing without collecting rent. So it's all kind of tied up, and it's a vicious circle. And so when we think about housing, and especially in a city like Bombay, you have to think about urban development and integrated urban development.
Dick, we're having pretty much the same discussion in the Netherlands, in a completely different society and a different set of governance rules about the role of the state in providing housing. We've also given a lot to the market in recent years.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you could say, even if you look back a longer way, that history keeps repeating itself. I even always like to make the comparison with what happened 150 years ago here, that when the working class in our cities were living in really horrible conditions. And that was also a time that capitalism had a big C, and the state thought, well, developers will take care of it, but it didn't happen. So we needed first philanthropic institutes and then housing corporations to take care of housing for people who can afford little. And that led, of course, to an amazing tradition of housing here in Amsterdam or in other places. But also here in the last 20, 30 years, that the initiative has been taken over more and more by commercial developers, and they have simply a different viewpoint. And of course, the situation is not so grim here as in Mumbai, but in Mumbai, that's also why the Mumbai case is so interesting. It shows in the most extreme way what can happen if you leave the free market to deal with these issues. Because also India, in the after independence in the 50s and 60s, then also, and maybe Sameep knows more about it, architects really also were working on the housing issue, created beautiful projects. Architects like Doshi, who recently won
The Pritzker
the
Prize.
Pritzker Prize, Charles Correa, beautiful examples, but they're simply disappearing there. And now it's taken over by the market, which leads to housing that indeed makes people ill, even without the coronavirus. Yeah.
Let's look at the picture of Sameep, please.
No, I was just going to add to what Vidhi was saying and your question to her about why are people leaving. It doesn't talk about the quality of the house. Actually, the thing about the house also is that it's not just a place to live, it's also a place of production. And I think once those economies start splitting, therein lies the crisis. That now you don't have a place that you can actually generate income of, and you have to go back to your village to be able to sustain yourself. And I think that really is a kind of tie-in that we need to kind of keep in mind.
Let's look at another image of one of the chawls that's in the book, Hamaji Nagar. This doesn't look to me like a particularly Indian place. This could be in, I don't know, Dick, Rotterdam?
Well, okay. It could be in many parts of the world,
okay.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So does this, so how unique is this? What's the special quality of this?
Well, actually, Sambhaji Nagar and some of the other projects in the book are basically projects that are built by the state, by a government body called MADA, which actually builds very reasonably decent living spaces. They have a constitutional mandate that talks about the fact that they're not going to try and build luxury housing. They're going to build housing for the middle class and build it in a way that provides a certain kind of open space and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, what's also happened is that now MADA, which is a state body, also is starting to say that they will need to collaborate with developers to build these projects going forward. And it's already we already know what's happened with developers trying to build slum redevelopment projects, which are absolutely inhuman to live in. We all know that there are bottlenecks in slums in terms of light, ventilation, services, but it's even worse in developer-built state housing, which Dick might be showing you. One can only kind of shudder and to think about what might be built by MADA once they start collaborating with developers.
I think this is an example of the one you mean.
Yeah, absolutely.
Dreadful.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And this is on the conscience of the state?
Yes. So it's a state-enabled housing project, which is it's called the Slum Rehabilitation Scheme, which allows a developer to, if there's an existing slum, the developer can take that entire piece of land, build free housing for the residents, and build an equal amount of housing for sale. Unfortunately, it doesn't talk about partitioning the land 50% to each category. It partitions the land to a minimal amount for the people living in the slum and keeps the largest amount for the private developer. And that's why you get these. It's like warehousing people, really. I mean, it's that bad. So,
is the population of Mumbai still growing? Because it's been growing fast for a long time.
Well, I think growth rates have slowed down, but it's still growing. I think there are figures of around we're talking about 20 million, and in that kind of vicinity. So, yeah.
I wanted to ask you something. Your favorite chawl.
So I think my favorite chawl is by far the Swadeshi market. I mean, I really like BDD as well, but the Swadeshi market project is really special. I took Dick to the chawl. We did a tour together. It's incredible. It's basically like any other mixed-use development that you'd have in your city, where you'd have commercial program at the bottom, stores and things like that, and on the top you actually have housing.
We have a couple images. No, show us the street image,
right.
number 8.
So what's really incredible is the fact that the city doesn't stop at the building. It actually extends through the building. So you've got these beautiful double height streets that take you from one part of the city to the other. So you can literally take a shortcut if you want to go to another part of the city going through the building. And in terms of scale, it's roughly about 3/4 the size of a Manhattan city block. So it's substantially large.
Wow. But the image
yeah,
we
yeah,
just saw, Sameep, the image we just saw of the street side of Swadeshi, that doesn't look
Right.
like worker housing at all.
Exactly. Exactly. So what you have to do is look at the next image, which was pulled up. And yeah, so these are
The roofs?
on the up. Yeah, they're on the upper floor. So there is a podium. There's an upper floor which becomes like a elevated ground plane, where you again have courtyards. You again have this kind of these chawls for people to stay in. So yeah, it's an incredible project. And also, what's really special about the project is the fact that it seamlessly networks back into the city. So there is no you can't really tell whether you're moving through a building or you're moving through the city once you're walking down those streets. But when you come to the upper level, it's completely residential. And what's also interesting is a lot of the construction was done in the early 1900s with imported sections that were brought in from the US and cast iron sections that we used to build the entire project. Yeah. It's really a special project.
This interior we were just looking at with this gentleman sitting on the drawers, reading the newspaper, and it's obviously chat distance across the courtyard.
Absolutely.
This seems like it looks like a little small scale neighborhood all in its own right, sort of separate from that enormous urban configuration that we saw from the street.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There are these kind of incredibly varied scales that exist within the same in the same development, and it's and also when you talked about the fact that it's almost the proximity between people on both sides of the corridor almost creates this large community living room sort of space, which is actually incredible, and it's found in a lot of projects, not just this one. And what you also find are narratives of people who stay in these spaces who talk about how they actually feel that the entire set, the entire building is actually a family, and it's if they ever need help, they call out to anyone from a floor next to theirs or the the floor below, and they'll come up to help. And it's really that sense of community that's fostered by this kind of architecture. And I think therein lies one of the reasons why we actually did the book, which is to be able to tie the architectural tectonic to this production of community. And I think that's what we hope you'd get out of it as well.
And Vidhi, I'm sure you've been to Swadeshi as well.
I haven't actually.
Really? Well, high time.
It's a hidden treasure in Mumbai.
Right.
Yeah.
Dick, you have been because you went with with Sameep. So the lower floor is commercial, and you can walk straight through the building as a sort of passageway through the city, and people live upstairs.
Exactly.
Are those two separate worlds, or
No, I think
meet?
they really work together. It's indeed an amazing place. It's in the heart of one of the densest part of the more historic part of Mumbai, and indeed it's almost hidden. I think it's also threatened because you see the shiny apartment towers for the middle class approaching because of its central location.
But wait a minute, it's almost as big as a Manhattan block, and it's a hidden gem? How can you hide something that big?
No, maybe also because you saw the facade, you don't expect that there's a whole, let's say, double world of commerce and residential behind it. Yeah. And you can't guess, let's say, what's behind it and the distance. But yeah, maybe because you also asked me, how does that relate, let's say, maybe to what we are experiencing in the Netherlands? I think this is, for example, can be a great inspiration. I was last weekend, in these times you go out walking and cycling more. I was cycling north of Rotterdam, the periphery of Rotterdam, and everywhere you see new big storage halls, expedition centers rising up. And the little space in between left over is filled in with small fake farmhouse villas, which is really, quite disastrous. So you think, why don't you build those houses on top of these commercial buildings? at least from the house you have a nice view and you don't have to look at this blind box. And there's still some space, green space left over. So, of course, we know this concept of a double ground level, but the Swadeshi Markt, I think, is really the best example I've ever seen of it. Yeah.
Perhaps an interesting modern-day parallel would be the market hall in Rotterdam.
Yeah,
With
exactly.
a market, a covered market on the ground floor, and then apartments above in this amazing building
Or
by
maybe
MBRDV.
Portsam Park's shopping center in Almere.
Yeah.
It's the same idea, but they remain incidents. And I think also the Swadeshi also shows that after 100 years, it's a really old project, it's still there and it works. Yeah.
And is there something you can take from Swadeshi and apply within the context of the Netherlands? This idea of the building as a passageway through the city, making it porous, I guess you could say?
Yeah.
Would that work here? Could we do that?
Well, I think maybe we're a little bit more afraid of that, also of mixing. I think what we can really learn from it, that mixing housing and commercial activities, but much more extreme, I think, even than the market hall, because there it's still very much divided. But here, the border is very porous. And what you also see is that some of the housing over time also got a commercial function. So it's again this flexibility over time. That's possible. And of course in India it's maybe easier. There are less rules or less regulations.
Well,
are
there are
maybe
rules,
not.
they're just not
But I
followed.
think that changing over time, that the project makes that possible is also a remarkable quality.
Yeah. Like our canal houses, which have
Yeah.
changed function through over 3 centuries now and are still very functional. But Sameep, I wanted to come back to something you said just now, talking about whether this typology is adaptable for us nowadays. You said something about the building codes that need to be updated.
Yeah, so what's happened is, a lot of these buildings were actually built as a reaction to the plague of 1898, where people, some through, of course, design, and some through just an intuitive understanding of what it took to make livable spaces, created these projects to allow for very good ventilation, very good light in the rooms, and so on and so forth. And so those became parameters to actually create this kind of architecture. So light, ventilation, so on and so forth. Unfortunately, what's happened is that those paradigms have slowly gotten diluted to the point where with land becoming valuable, what's also become valuable is the area that you're building. And now the parameters of light and ventilation are no longer operating, and it's really just the square footage that you're actually looking at. So which is why building code now needs to move in some sense back a little bit from the idea of being quantitative to being qualitative, to see what kind of light and ventilation you actually get in these spaces. What are the social spaces that are created for people to interact with, and how would they be better than just putting a little clubhouse in the corner of the building? So is there a means to do that? But that can only happen once we have building code reform or the kind of rules that actually allow us to build in particular.
Vidi, let me ask you then a difficult question. Is there any point in reforming the building code if the codes aren't enforced? You mentioned that just now.
Yes, I did. That was a bit too cynical, I think. I mean, yes, I stand by what I said, that the building codes are not as rigorously implemented or followed as they are perhaps in the West. But it's also not to say that it's complete anarchy. And, I think, as Sameep said, after the plague of 1898 is when there was this building code reform, and a lot of the chawls that we look at, that we see today, they were built on those principles and, incorporating the whole idea of public health and sanitation and clean air and ventilation and all of that. And somewhere along the way, it just got lost, and I think the other significance of reforming building code is, it is obviously it's a top-down measure. It's a government sort of intervention, but if you reform it and you're sort of taking all of these issues into consideration, it's also a signal from the top saying that we care about this, we are looking at it. So, you may not get 100% of the way that you want to, but even if you get 50% or 60%, I think it's a win. So yes, I'm all for building code reform.
Okay. You mentioned the BDD Chawl, Bombay Development
Directorate.
That was state-owned and state-built, and most of the other ones are private. What difference did that make in how BBD turned out?
I think just the typology itself, and, so if you, like you said, it's been referred to as very much an army barracks style.
Yeah. We have a picture which sort of enforces that.
Right, exactly, exactly.
It also shows what's happening next to
Behind it, yeah, exactly. And so I think one is, that regimented kind of design, but also at the same time, the kind of, so the space between the buildings, again, going back to, there was this, they were built with the idea of we need to have enough light and ventilation between buildings, within and between buildings, so you have that space. And also the sheer number of them. So I think so there are 4 locations within Bombay, all within Old Bombay, South Bombay, where these BDD chawls are, and Worli, which is I think where these pictures are from, is the biggest. There are 121 of them. The others are much smaller. They're like 30, maybe 20, things like that. So, I think that's one big difference between a state-owned versus a developer or a private sector-owned chawl, or any kind of project, right? Because you have, as the government, you
just
have all
roll
this.
them out.
Yeah, you can roll them out, and that's what they did.
And the BBD I read in the book, very interesting, was a hotbed of civil activism by the Untouchables, who were protesting the system whereby they, because of their class, have no rights at all. Why do you think that the BBDs became a focal point for civic unrest?
I think what it did was, because it was built by the government and, it brought together the working class from all over the country, right? So you come with different points of view, and then, you're living in such close quarters, you're working together, you're with each other all the time. Sameep mentioned, there used to be, I forget what they were called, but there were these, the women who used to cook food on the ground floor and bring it. So it kind of sort of fostered a lot of that coming together and idea generation and exchange of ideas, which I think, would not be possible in smaller, more, closer communities perhaps, but because there were people from different backgrounds coming together, I think that's what really made it a hotbed for that, for the kind of civil unrest and activism.
And did it also make it easier for the powers that be to repress this activism because it was all concentrated in one place?
Yes, that's kind of logical, but again, at the same time, I think, and I think that's actually such a pertinent question in today's times as we are dealing with a civil unrest of another form. And obviously that's on a global scale, but at the same time, I think, when civil unrest, when it reaches a certain point, it doesn't matter if it's geographically concentrated or not. There's only so much that the powers that be can do. Again, it's my optimism speaking, but yeah.
Let's look at another image of the BBD in Worli. The BBD was actually, this one was built in 1925, so not as long ago as Swadeshi, for example. But if you see it, can we have the image, please? It looks, the next one, it looks rather decrepit. It looks like it's falling apart.
Right.
What is the condition of the chawls in general and of the BBD now?
So I think it's very interesting that you asked that because, so full disclosure, my undergraduate thesis when I was in architecture school was on the BDD chawls in Worli. So
this is why I'm asking you.
Yeah, so I know it pretty intimately.
Yeah.
So I would say that, so the way the BDD chawls are, so it's under the purview of the Public Works Department of the city of Bombay. And at the same time, each building has its own maintenance or welfare committee. And
Not a very active committee looking,
not
judging by the picture.
clearly not these buildings, but I don't know which other pictures we have, but there are actually some of them which are pretty well maintained, both from the outside and inside. And I think again, because it's such a huge project, right? It's 121 buildings, and you just, as you walk through them, you realize that some are just better maintained than the others. And I think it does boil down to sort of the community, the residents, the welfare committees coming together, in some better so than in others, like maybe the ones that we're looking at.
And we're here talking about the relevance now of the chawls, but how does the city see that? Sameep, can you address this? Are these seen as landmarks of architectural innovation? Are they protected by law at all, or are they just left to slowly fade away?
Well, I would like to think that they are architectural marvels, but the problem is that the state sees them as derelict or soon going to be derelict buildings, and the chawls are fast disappearing. They're not going to be around for very much longer. So it's unfortunate that while that, of course, some of them, like was being said earlier, are not in great condition, but there are lots of others that still are. There are a couple in the book that are in fantastic condition. But for them to withstand real estate pressures once the markets involved it's going to be impossible. So what's also interesting in some sense is the fact that these projects are also, some of them are rent controlled, some of them operate with, the private ones specifically. They operate with very low rents, and there isn't an incentive for the landlord to actually look at renovating them, and which is why a lot of them, they would just prefer that it gets derelict, and then they can rebuild or sell it to somebody else and make a lot of money. So unless there is at a policy level and a way to kind of understand how rent control is working, how development is working, I don't see the chawls being around for very much longer. The BDD is anyway being redeveloped. There's already a project assigned to redevelop BDD, and it's really, really unfortunate that we're going to lose the communities that live there, the access to open space that they have, the access to light and ventilation that they have, right in the heart of the city. Is incredible, and once it's redeveloped, it's never going to be the same.
It reminds me of the fate of the hutongs in China.
Yeah, absolutely.
Strong communities, pleasant places to live, but they're being bulldozed by the day.
Yeah.
Dick, did you, as a visitor to the chawls, did they strike you as gems of innovation?
Yes. Yeah. Well, certainly for me, the first time I saw them was indeed with Sameep. He took me on it was almost a nightly tour, so quite mysterious, entering these courtyards and then suddenly see these colorful worlds full of people. And for me, it was a discovery because I had been already a couple of times in Mumbai, but, certainly as a first-time visitor, you think this is a city that has two ways of living. Either you live in an apartment block in a good or maybe worse condition, or they're the slums. 50% of the population lives in informal settlements. And that's it. That's the reality of Mumbai. And then you find these chawls, these hidden places, and you see there is another world, and there's another possibility of housing in a high density with quality. And I think that's why they are indeed, how did you say it? Examples of innovation and inspiration. And it's really sad if they disappear and are forgotten. Because then indeed we're only left with those two very harsh realities of the tower block and the informal settlement.
What will happen, Sameep, when the chawls do disappear? Will this be taken over completely by the market and building cookie-cutter tract houses, or what's next?
Yeah, no. it'll be exactly that. It'll be tall apartment buildings for maybe a few residents of the chawl, and the rest is going to be luxury housing. Just to also give you an example, and it's again really interesting that we're talking about it at this time. The entire migrant crisis that you saw during COVID of people leaving the city and going away. Now the Biri chawls were actually built by the state to attract migrants to come into the city to work in textile mills. So you see, what was happening is the exact opposite. And it just came to my mind, and I thought I had to say that. But yeah, I mean, what's going to happen is there's going to be more luxury housing built in a city which already has an oversupply of luxury housing. There is some absurd number of, I mean, I think it's about 100,000 unsold apartments in the city of Mumbai. I mean, there is still more and more being built, and it's really incredibly stupid, both by the state and the developers to keep building that kind of housing, despite the fact that the real need is actually at the level of a social or affordable housing, which the state actually needs to take a huge amount of ownership for. But no, that's not happening, and we're going to get more apartment buildings.
With less light, less ventilation, less social space. Yeah. We have a, did you want to add something, Vidhi?
No.
We have an image of another chawl, which I thought you might like to comment on, Bhatia. We have an outdoor image and also the interior courtyard, which looks so charming. It's not as grand as Swadeshi, but you see the life here. And I wondered, especially when I looked at this picture that is so homey and so full of a sense of community, where will these people go? Will they be forced into the slums, or will they be forced to the edge of the city, or will they have to leave Mumbai altogether?
No, so actually, Bhatia is one of the few chawls that is already a cooperative. So in some sense,
It's a cooperative.
It's a cooperative. So they have rights to where they are staying at. But there are other chawls similar to Bhatia where that won't be the case. And the people, if they're lucky, will be rehoused in the building that's going to be built in place of the chawl. But in either case, they're going to be living in a building with not enough access to light and ventilation, not the kind of light and ventilation that they've been living with thus far. And there are generations that have grown up in spaces like this. So it's not just a family that comes in and leaves. They've been there for maybe 2 generations, 3 generations. So yeah, all that's gone.
It looks like a very happy place to grow up. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So what I'm hoping, Sameep, this is me, the eternal optimist as well, I'm hoping, Sameep, that this book will reach the people in Mumbai who need to decide that the chawl deserves a new life in your city. Is that possible?
Well, one can always hope. Fingers crossed.
Vidhi, how open is government to a model like this that has proved itself over a long period of time?
In Bombay specifically?
Yeah.
Not at all.
Not at all.
I mean, like Sameep said, the government also thinks like a developer. It's... You don't expect a developer or private sector to sort of come in and, say, okay, this is how I understand the value, the historical value, the architectural value, the innovative value of whether it's chawls or other typologies, and I'm going to invest in that, right? Private sector of its own accord is never going to do that. And which is why you really need that sort of push from the government. And unfortunately, in Bombay and obviously a lot of other big cities around the world, we talked about the Netherlands as well. There's just more. There's less and less. There's more private sector sort of the commercial interests coming in, and government is more and more aligned with that way of thinking, unfortunately. So,
how has the housing situation struck you as a new inhabitant of the Netherlands here? We have our problems too.
Right. No, I agree. So I think, obviously I feel like I hear, and especially when my husband and I, before we moved here and we were looking for an apartment, we heard the same thing you hear in any city is, housing is really expensive. And, there's a gap. So I think in Amsterdam, what everyone was saying was you'll find homes, apartments for less than, say, 1,500 euros, but then, or maybe, yeah, but then there's a huge, or no, less than about 1,200, but then between 1,200 and say 2,000, there's a huge gap. And, the reality is that the majority of the population, whether you're from here or you're expats or whatever, they're looking at the 1,500 or the 1,200 and below, and there's a real dearth of that. So I think it's very similar, unfortunately, to the issues in the rest of the world in other big cities as well. And I think the other thing I've been hearing from people is that, the kind of innovation that did happen. So as an architecture student, I remember coming to Amsterdam 10, 11 years ago, and my friends and I were super excited. We said, we're going to go, and we did go see MVRDV and all of these fantastic housing projects, right? And from what I hear, that kind of innovation, and even before MVRDV and folks, it just doesn't exist anymore.
Is that true, Dick?
I don't know if I'm right.
Yeah, I think the times are changing here as well. I think it was recently an article of Bernard Hulsman in NRC.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the sad things that, and I mentioned it already, this great history here of the housing corporations, really, let's say, being on the forefront of innovation and daring to take also risk by hiring young architects with new ideas, that has disappeared in the last 15, 20 years. Yeah. And I think we need to bring that back. Yeah.
A lot of that is because of the rules and regulations of Europe, huh? You have to fulfill all sorts of demands in order to be allowed to build something.
Yeah,
and
but also obviously here, again, not so extreme, but also the larger new developments in our cities and outside the cities, the commercial developers are in command. And they give a part to a housing corporation. And of course, 30 years ago, it was maybe the other way around. And it does make a difference.
Yeah. So politics does matter. Yeah.
Yeah.
We have just a few minutes left, so I'd like to urge anybody in the audience who'd like to ask our speakers a question to do so now before our time runs out. And then my final question, actually, two brief questions. Vidhi, you've traveled a lot. You've lived in Boston, in New York, in Mumbai, now in Amsterdam. How would you compare the housing situation in Mumbai to those of other cities? For example, in the US, we have these horrible housing projects, which are all in the news now, also yesterday at George Floyd's funeral. Your thoughts?
So as Dick said, the degree of severity is different, say in Bombay versus Amsterdam versus Boston, but unfortunately it's the same story everywhere, where, and especially it's the working class that's getting marginalized, and unfortunately it takes a pandemic like the one we're living through right now for those issues to really come to the fore, and, for people to sit up and take notice. And one of the big things I've noticed, doesn't matter where in the world it is. Every time I go to a new place, this is what I think. So Bertrand Renault said, cities are built the way they're financed. And I think that is just so true. Going back to what you were saying, in the Netherlands, you've now got commercial developers coming in, and the way the housing and the way the cities are being built today are very different than they were, say, 30 years ago. So it holds true, unfortunately, everywhere.
Different form, same story. Yeah. My final question then is for Sameep. Sameep, this book. Having heard this discussion, this book can be two things, and I'm wondering what you think it is. It can be the swan song marking the demise of a form of innovation that will never come back in Indian society. And it can also be a manifest for governments here, there, and all over the world to take lessons from the past and apply them to the future to make a humane and livable society. Which?
I think, well, I wouldn't say that it's a swan song primarily because what is really unique about the projects that we've documented is not the fact that they're in their original state as they were built, but the fact that they evolved into something that became completely new.
Yeah.
And I think it's this change that is critical for us to learn. And if that's the message that the government, architects, whoever reads the book is able to take from it, I think we'd have done a decent job with the work that we set out to do. So it's really not the physical entity of the project, but it's really its ability to change over time.
Well, congratulations to Sameep Padora for the beautiful book published by NAI 010 Publishers. And thanks to Vidi Garg for joining us, and to Dick van Gameren, and to Pakhuis de Zwijger for hospitality and their wonderful studio. Thank you for joining us, and you can see this again on the website of Pakhuis de Zwijger, and hope to see you at another of the live events soon.